mind that Palestinians have been wronged. And unless and until that white man in his mind was not convinced that Palestinians were wrong, Palestinians were not wrong. It is the question of getting rid of that fiction inside your brain. The result, I'll stop right here, the result is active agency in playing identity politics against itself. Namely, you cross border. As a Muslim, you identify with a Mexican. As a Latino, you identify with women. As women, you identify with whoever else happens to be at the receiving end of Trump's lunacy. To conclude, the condition in the United States today is very volatile, but mostly the battle is being dragged into liberalism that cannot tolerate and understand and fathom itself at the receiving end of tyranny, and the kind of white supremacy that now has a place inside the White House, and the fact that now in the major selections of Trump into the White House, you actually have pronounced anti-Semitic Zionists like Steve Bannon, proven, I mean, court affidavits that he's an anti-Semite, but a vocal advocate of Israel. These are the seamless state of liberalism that now is coming to pieces. Inside that, in my opinion, identity politics has to be used strategically, not quintessentially. The quintessence of identity politics has to be dismantled by playing it against itself. Thank you.
I have a quick question on this insightful talk on the phenomenon of Trumpism in the United States, especially with regard to the identity politics.
Yes.
Don't you think that identity politics was there in the 2008 election when the Democrats brought an African American to run for president in the United States? And if it's the same case with Hillary Clinton in 2016, so we just moved from race to gender, but it didn't work in 2016 while it worked in 2008. So
you're absolutely right that the identity politics existed both in 2008 and in 2012, in all of them. And as you recall the question whether or not Obama was a Muslim, I mean, there was issue whether he was an American, there was all issue that was he a Muslim, was paramount. And he kept saying, I'm not a Muslim. Look, I went to this church, and you may recall he kept referring to a particularly prominent pastor in Chicago, Jeremiah Wright, as the church that he and his wife, Michelle Obama, used to go. So he kept attaching himself to Jeremiah Wright, and then they went after Jeremiah Wright and discovered that Jeremiah Wright was actually a black liberation theologian. And they found tapes of Jeremiah Wright in which he was denouncing racism and colonialism and all of that. And suddenly, again, if you look at the 2007, Obama gave a very important speech in Philadelphia, which began the idea of post-racial society, that now we are post-racial, that Obama, an African American, is actually defending the case of being beyond race. And then when, over the course of the 8 years of militarization of Ferguson police and the mass incarceration, killing of the Trevor Avon, etc., all indicated not only the society is not post-racial, actually has more entrenched racialized tension. Then this ultimately led to a condition that is, you wanted to shift the same politics from race into gender towards for the benefit of Hillary Clinton, but then Hillary Clinton's corruption, his link to the White House, his warmongering in Libya, Iraq, and potentially even in Syria, they began to come and haunt her. So the issue of identity politics has always remained the case. There are many examples. Skip Gates at Harvard, professor at Harvard, you remember, he was arrested by a police officer, and then it turned out that it was not a racial case. Continues to be the case in the United States. However, this time, as I said at the beginning, the category white working class is not entirely untrue. Of course, there is a category of white labor class in places like, say, Pennsylvania. But that doesn't exhaust explaining what has happened. For that, we need more. First of all, the Democratic National Convention needs to look at its own behavior before jumping into a racialized and demonized categorization of the labor class.
Thank you. Questions?
Hi. So, in the context of Trump's win, there has been a lot of talk as well about the losers and the winners of globalization. So the losers voting for Trump and the winners voting for the liberals, basically. So where do globalization fit here in this picture of identity politics and then trying to reach this area or era of post-identity politics? Does globalization itself, does it enforce identity politics, or maybe it's a way to overcome it, or how do you see it?
Usually these days they put the Trump victory in the United States and Brexit in UK as two indications that these are the losers of globalization, and as a result xenophobic nationalism is emerging. Here is the case of Brexit, here is the case of Trump, and as a result, away from globalization, the answer or the pivot is towards xenophobic nationalism. But the way I read it, I place Brexit in the context of Eurozone crisis. That is, you have had the rise of right-wing neo-Nazis, for example, in Greece during the austerity measures. But they are not the only factors. You have had a student uprising in UK. You have had labor unrest in France. You have had major labor unrest in Spain and Portugal. So I don't think that identity politics or this xenophobic nationalism is the response to globalization. Globalization has a fundamental crisis. The crisis is simple terms. I use these numbers that I have memorized them. Between 2000 and 2008, the military budget of the United States was number 33 and 11 zeros in front of it. 320 million human beings roam around the globe, not just from the south to the north. Now, most of the news comes from, oh, look, Africans are coming to Europe, Syrians are going to Europe. No. The factual evidence is that you could also have from the north going to the south. But the euphemisms, they're called expats. They're not called refugees or anything. So this is global. The other number, which is also crucial, is 850 million people living under the poverty line. That is, again, global. It has nothing to do with being South or North or Africa or Asia or Latin America. It's all over the place. When you put those three numbers together, intensification of the militarization of diplomacy, number one. Number two, increased hunger globally. Number three, labor migration around the globe. And fourth, or perhaps first more than anything else, is the question of environmental crisis, catastrophic environmental crisis, which today, to this very day, Obama just signed executive order protecting the offshore drilling between US and Canada, fearing legitimately that Obama will start drilling again offshore. These factors, these four factors, environment, migration, world hunger, and militarization of a relationship, these are the manifestations of globalization. And they are global, they are transnational, they have nothing to do with nation state or anything. You have legitimate labor uprisings in some countries, and you have student unrest, for example, in Quebec. You have massive anti-austerity demonstrations in Greece. You have anti-corruption demonstrations in Brazil, for example. So these are the indices that you look at, not just trying to demonize the labor class, say white labor class, and laser beam on them and say, oh, they're xenophobic and they're nationalists and they hate foreigners and so forth. Some of this rhetoric is actually within the liberal conversation. That they, on one hand, I was in a show with Naomi Wolf. On one hand, they say, well, the unions have been gutted out. On the other hand, they become protectionist with labor migration, say, from Mexico. They don't want laborers come from Mexico, as if laborers from Mexico are coming for good weather in California or in New York. They're chasing after capital. So the circulatory disposition of capital and labor, capital chases after cheap labor comes after the capital, that is the issue. The issue is not that, for example, in the United States, in certain states, such as Michigan or in Ohio, you may have actually white labor class voting for Trump. You have to look at it in the context. In Detroit, there is no safe drinking water. Under Obama, this has nothing to do with Trump. No safe drinking water. And yet Obama gives $38 billion military aid to Israel over the next 10 years, after he's no longer in the office. This is the discrepancy between aggressive militarization and basic social services. I mean, New York, we're lucky there is a public school, but in places like Chicago and in Philadelphia, public school is disappearing. Okay, now nobody talks about it. Suddenly they talk about this new freaking rabid Zionist that has been appointed as Israeli U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. Oh, he has no diplomatic, as if this is the issue. He has no diplomatic experience. Well, Obama has been given, this is a tradition, we know it since Weber. This is a tradition in American politics. The more you give to the campaign, then they compensate. You give you some ambassador in, I don't know, in Paris or in Tokyo or etc. So there is something structural in the American politics that needs to be considered rather than you can demonize Trump from here until eternity and legitimate with perfectly legitimate reasons. But there is something far more, right now everybody is scared of fossil fuel potentials of Trump. Guardian did an extraordinary investigative journalism that in fact Obama had invested $38 billion in fossil fuels in South Africa, in India, and in Australia. It's right on the front page of The Guardian. You can go see it. So this is a structure that has nothing to do with Obama when and this. Now there is this, you know, like Muslims stone, you know, in Hajj pilgrim, they're now stoning Trump. Yes, Trump has a lot to be thinking, but there is something far more structural. It was a longer answer than you expected, Ben.
So you talk about liberal identity politics, and obviously, like, we see that with the Hillary campaign. But I mean, I've read before, and I think it's an interesting hypothesis that potentially the alt-right movement and white nationalism is like a backlash to left identity politics as like a white male identity politics. And I was wondering, like, if you see the truth in that, or just kind of what your thoughts are on it.
Okay. You see, this is the problem with gadgets. They are more important than humans. No. In my opinion, alt-right and remains a lunatic fringe. Right now, it is crowding our analytics. What we call about identity politics is the fact of a racialized, gendered diversity that has happened by virtue of waves of labor migration. After the Civil Rights Act of 1968, in the entire decade of 1970s, statistically, for every 8 Asian and Latino who came to United States, 1 Western European came to United States. This is in the 70s. In the 80s, again statistically, for every 6 Asian and Latino who came to United States, 1 Western European came to United States. So, the demographic composition of the society began to change. Where did we notice this demographic change other than university campuses? Because this is due to the second generation, for example, the Korean migration in the 70s. Mom and dad were selling vegetables, fruits, which I always say, before this wave of Korean labor migrations, every other street corner in the US, those of you who have been, you know, was this ghastly hot dog. After the Korean migration, they made Americans vegetable and fruit eaters. Americans were not vegetable and fruit eaters. So I say they have added millions of years to your average life, these layers of migrations. So university campuses became the site that the literature of it is available. Universities began to establish quotas of how many, for example, Korean students they would accept. If you look at the publication of the closing of American Mind, what's his name? Alan Bloom. I so dislike him, I keep repressing his name. Alan Bloom's the closing of the American Mind. What is he talking about, closing of the American Mind? Because he goes to his classroom, nobody has read the Bible, nobody has read Plato, nobody has read Shakespeare. Now, literacy is disappearing. No, there's also a demographic change. First of all, they come from countries that they don't read Shakespeare, they read their own Shakespeare, they don't read Plato, they don't read their own Plato. But more than that, these gadgets were coming. The literacy was being redefined. Digital age was coming. So the same people who didn't know their Shakespeare and Plato and Bible, they could draw circles around Alan Bloom so far as their computer literacy was concerned. So there was, and the same logic when, for example, Huntington wrote his Clash of Civilization. I've already written on this. Clash of Civilization had nothing to do with Clash of Civilization. Chinese are this and the Muslims are this. Had to do with the demographic changes within the United States. He was writing against this fact that the demographic composition of the United States was changing. So, to go back to your question, long before this election, these demographic changes by virtue of migration were happening, and much of these labor migrations are necessary cheap labor. You have the politicians' rhetoric, oh, we're going to build the walls, but the fact that you need cheap labor to collect your tomatoes and strawberries and so forth. On my campus, Susan, you may remember, on my campus, when there are ads for dishwashers, they just write them in Spanish, they don't write in English. Okay, you have a Chinese restaurant and a Lebanese restaurant, you remember Amir, and a Korean restaurant, but the underground, the subaltern, they're all Mexicans washing dishes. And then very soon, Mexicans start learning Arabic in the Lebanese restaurant. This is my point, that too much narrow emphasis on this particular election and yes, the alt-right is now has found a space to articulate itself. What are they saying? Oh, what about our right? It is our politics. But the current demographic changes that are happening in the society are much stronger. And the simple fact